Watch the screen to be reminded of a few of the campaigns the WI has been involved in. The NFWI is the largest voluntary organisation for women in Great Britain, with over 212,000 members in more than 6,500 WIs, all charities governed by a constitution and rules. Set up in 1915 specifically for rural areas, it gave women a voice, and the WI continues to have a voice in issues today, from climate change to children's diet and human trafficking to supermarket expansion, and it is a voice that is listened to. In 1923, the AGM of the NFWI affirmed that it was a women's-only organisation. The WI is inclusive and aims to inspire women. 6 Dorset WIs will be celebrating their centenaries in 2017, and our centenary in November coincides with the Dorset Federation centenary. When the WI was founded, the First World War was in its second year. It was total war, and it had a new aspect, the home front. The WI had been established in 1915 to rally and inspire countrywomen and get them to grow and preserve food. Everyone was involved in the war effort, not just the men fighting on the many fronts. Women were taking on the men's jobs in factories. Female servants were leaving their situations in droves to work in munitions, to drive buses and trains. But life in the countryside continued much as before. The WI was originally established under the protection of the Board of Agriculture, and the work of countrywomen was vital to the war effort to sustain the home front. By 1917, this work was especially vital because of the German blockade of the British coast. Rumours that we had only 3 weeks' supply of food in reserve meant that the only food we would have would be that which could be grown and preserved. The 1917 harvest had been disastrous. Labour on farms was scarce, and the U-boats prevented us importing half of our food needs. In 1916, Lloyd George and the suffragettes had done a deal that militancy would end until the war was over, and in return, the government would give some women the vote. Many suffragists put their energies into WI groups. In 1917, 6 were opened in Dorset, 1 in Burton Bradstock. At the 3rd AGM in 1919, the WI achieved its independence from the Board of Agriculture. It was led for 30 years by Lady Denman and her Vice-Chair Grace Haddow, an Oxford Don, energetic, inspiring women who could attract others to their cause, a cause based on genuine concern that the countrywoman had a bad deal. The WI also got its anthem at this time. Sir Hubert Parry wrote the music to words written by William Blake in about 1807. Parry set the poem to music in March 1916, and Millicent Fawcett, leader of the moderate National Union of Women's Suffrage Societies, persuaded him to let her suffragist group adopt Jerusalem in March 1918. It was later adopted as the WI anthem and sung first at the 1924 AGM in the Queen's Hall, and Parry's executors gave the musical copyright to the NFWI. Through the WI, women could now share their experiences and unite in a way impossible before. The problem was that the WI was seen as a middle-class organisation for middle-class women, later epitomised by Denman College, opened in September 1948. The Burton Bradstock branch of the WI was opened on the 27th of November 1917. All branches were encouraged to make a banner symbolising their area. The tapestry decided on depicts a farming and fishing community, which is what Burton Bradstock was in those days. Most of the village was owned by the Pitt Rivers family, and the majority of people were very poor. The war didn't have a great effect on the village, as most men were in reserved occupations. Working in the flax mill or on one of the 10 farms, or fishing from Hythe Beach, seen here at the time. Cars still went up the cliff. Beach Road wasn't built then. Some men did volunteer for the adventure, and some were already in the Navy, but conscription more or less passed the village by. This is how the village looked at the time of the First War. There was no electricity until the mid-1930s, and most houses at the time of the 1958 sale still had outside privies. Chamber pots were emptied into the Leat and the river. Main drains were late in coming to the village. This shows the road the first WI ladies would have walked down to the school, as it was in 1917. There were 2 social classes in Burton Bradstock, the haves and the have-nots. In the latter group, in 1900, it is listed that 29 older married women worked as outworkers, braiding nets at home. 17 women worked in the flax mill, 13 were in service, 13 were dairymaids, and there were 4 pupil teachers. There were 2 governesses, a postmistress, and 5 women who worked as washerwomen. The middle and upper class women of Burton Bradstock lived in the big houses. They were ready to join the WI, but usually only on the committee. These women had always done charitable deeds in the village. visiting the sick and taking food to the very poor, something that people remember happening even in the 1950s. The farmers' wives, even though their husbands were tenants, had status. These women rallied to the cause and helped set up the WI in the village. Between them, they had the time, the skills, and the organisational ability to make the group work. And note that on this photo, there is no village hall. On the 27th of November 1917, a group of these village women met in the old schoolroom to set up Burton Bradstock's WI. Mrs. Clowes from the Board of Agriculture came to the village to give a lecture in the schoolroom on the work and aims of the WI. The meeting opened with the hymn, "O God, our help in ages past," and ended with the national anthem. A resolution was passed, quote, "to establish a branch in this village." A committee of 12 was formed, with Mrs. Harrison, the vicar's wife, being elected president, Mrs. Howarth, the headmaster's wife, treasurer, Mrs. Gillingham, secretary, and Miss Lenthall from Manor Farm as assistant secretary. The committee was elected for a year. They agreed the meeting night, time and place, the second Tuesday of the month at 7 p.m. in the schoolroom. Subs were 2 shillings a year. The first regular meeting was on Tuesday, the 11th of December 1917, when 42 women joined. At the second meeting in January 1918, there was a talk on food economy by Mrs. Edwards, an exhibition of war cookery, refreshments, then gramophone selections, and a dramatic sketch by Mrs. Edwards, a very busy lady, and a Mrs. Bond. A play or sketch featured in many early meetings. This slide shows Gladys Gale, Rob Gale's wife and Janet Guppy's aunt, and not wearing a hat, at the fete in 1920, selling handmade goods, and with the WI telling fortunes. Now that could be a new stall for you, Val and Jenny. The floral parade of 1920 down Church Street was a tradition which the WI continued and organised. The working women of the village didn't join the WI immediately. They didn't have the time, and many were too shy to mingle with their betters. But it was their skills and those of the farmers' wives that were most in demand. They could knit socks and balaclavas, craft something out of nothing, preserve anything, and when it came to rabbits, there was no end to their ingenuity. Rabbits had become synonymous with the WI, as Britain had plenty of rabbits, which could be made into pies and casseroles, their skin made into slippers and gloves, and their fur could trim an old coat or a hat. In 1914, we imported 11,000 rabbits for the table, and we never imported them again. WI members were encouraged to make the soft toy, Cuthbert the Rabbit, to sell for pin money. But some were so poorly made that Lady Denman bought them all up and hid them. The meetings in the village were originally held in the school, sometimes moving to Gage's, the White House, or the Rookery. Activities included lectures on good housekeeping, cookery, and handy hints, such as how to make starch from potatoes. There were dances for soldiers on leave, games, and afternoons spent listening to gramophone records. Remember, only the rich could afford a gramophone at home. A rabbit club was formed, as in World War II, and there was a sales table to raise money for prisoners of war in the big camp at Dorchester. Husbands were encouraged to make wooden toys to sell, and by 1919, Britain threatened Germany's pre-war monopoly in the making of wooden toys. In the first Treasurer's report for 1917-18, the following were recorded as outgoings, with a total of £1, 14 shillings and 10pence. In February 1919, the village WI meeting was cancelled because of the flu epidemic, and later that year, the minutes record that a letter of congratulation was sent to Lady Astor when she became the first woman to be elected to the House of Commons. Also in the minutes for 1919, under an item called Destruction of Rats, it is noted that active support was declined by the members. This photo shows the committee in June 1924. Mrs. Heenan, possibly shown back far left, was president for much of the 1920s, and meetings continued with magic lantern lectures, paper dress parades, make your own hat, a poultry show, an old folks party, and dancing classes beginning in 1931. How to tie a scarf was very popular talk then, so not much changes. Also in 1931, minutes record, quote, "No outing will take place unless 20 members definitely promise to go and pay in advance." As I said, nothing changes. However, by 1930, the WI had outgrown the school. If you look at this photograph of our WI with the Reverend Dittmer, you can see the proof of this. All big women. The chairs were too small, the WI had to pay rent, and the toilet facilities were, to quote from the minutes, unspeakable. Not surprising, as over 100 children each day had used the earth privies. The WI now needed a permanent home. One WI member, Alice Fielding, was the cousin of Captain Pitt Rivers, who owned most of the village. Miss Fielding and Miss Codrington, a distant cousin of the Duke of Wellington, and both seen here, lived at Gage's and were well known in the village. Miss Fielding had formed a girl guide company in the 1920s, and by 1930 both were WI committee members. Captain Pitt Rivers was persuaded that the village needed a hall for social, recreational and educational purposes, and he agreed to give land in the centre of the village if the WI would organise the building of the hall and pay for it. This is a copy of his letter, agreeing they could use his architect, Mr. Jupp, and his land agent, Mr. Sanctuary, who would liaise between all parties. First, the site had to be chosen, a choice between a plot in Shadrach or part of the plot opposite the rectory, used by a Mr. Smith to grow potatoes. Once a farm had stood there, but after it burned down on the 13th of July 1854, nothing had been built, so little clearing needed to be done. The plot was a 1/16 of an acre, and the freehold cost £40, about £900 today, which was bought by two ladies, probably Miss Codrington and Miss Fielding, but there is no record of names. Funds then had to be raised to build and furnish the hall, and the initial costs were put at £1,765. And bear in mind, this was the time of the Great Depression. Miss Codd, so called in the minutes by the secretary, was by now president, and she and Miss Fielding were on the building, entertainment and catering subcommittees. The money was guaranteed by Miss Codrington, who took a bank loan against her house, Gage's. The builder was Charles Hitchcock, seen here in 1937, smartly dressed in honour of George VI's coronation. Work began on the building in October 1930 with a minor amendment to the original plans to raise the roof by 3 feet to accommodate badminton in the hall. A steel frame was erected and the walls were filled in with wood, rubble, chicken wire and paper. It is now called, for insurance purposes, a non-standard build. A front porch was added to give some cupboard space. Work was completed in May 1931, just 7 months later. On the 28th of May, there was the official opening with photograph. Miss Codrington is fourth from the left on the front row, and Miss Fielding is far right, front row. The day continued with a country fair and a concert with songs by the Girl Guides. In the 1930s, this would be part of their repertoire. £80 profit was made, a large sum at that time, with a spending power of about £4,000 now. This slide shows Miss Fielding with the guides at the opening, and for whom she had got free use of the hall going forward. Notice the banner. Not everything went well. Mr. Smith, known as the Duke, and his wife had long terrorised the village, and he'd lost half of his potato patch to the hall. He didn't like the fact that there was a hall at all, and he complained about the siting of the septic tank and the use of the road to the west of the hall. The road proved to be a constant problem. Mr. Smith wanted a fence to be erected to secure his potato patch. This demand was only included after the contract had been signed and costs agreed. The WI said it couldn't agree to the extra cost, and anyway the fence would be a fire hazard. The WI refuted his allegations that children and animals were getting onto his land and ruining his crops, as he kept the gate firmly locked. But cattle and sheep did move through the village. In the end, Captain Pitt Rivers paid for the fence. The hall was furnished by appeals for donations of chairs, tables, kettles, curtains and cutlery, and a piano was purchased by Miss Codrington for £40 to be paid for over 3 years in 12 quarterly instalments of £3, 17 shillings. Even in 1931, the WI had to get public liability insurance, workers' compensation and fire policies. With the final cost of the building now reaching £1,820 9 shillings, about £36,000 today, and realised by a further bank loan, finances became a major concern. The hall was fast becoming a centre for village activities. This photo shows the WI in 1930 catering for some sort of event being held in and around the hall, even on the road as we do now. It was necessary to rent out the hall to various organisations, both inside and outside the village. In 1933, £120 was raised, a good amount which, quote, was sufficient for the running of the hall and the life of the Institute. A debate that year was held on the motion, "A man's life is easier than a woman's," and not surprisingly, the members thought it was. In 1934, a new heating system was installed, and 20 members were asked to lend £5 each, free of interest, for 2 years to meet the cost. Electricity was run into the hall for lighting, and a heating stove was put in. The loans were repaid throughout 1936 and into January 1937, as you can see from the cash book records. Take a look at the bank charges of around £32 per half year. A lot of money then and now. In the 1930s, an average of £130 per annum was raised from rent. The school took full advantage of the new hall for domestic science classes and concerts, though there was a complaint that children were running amok in the hall and caused some damage. In 1935, the President addressed a meeting and said, "Our institute should stand for education, recreation, amusement, and gathering of ourselves together. We should be a fellowship, having a standard in all we say and do. The best way of all is to help carry out loyally the wishes of the majority, whether you want what is voted on or not. Constructive criticism is always needed. Grumbling alone is no use." At the AGM in 1937, the President again told the members that they should, quote, "be more sisterly in their behaviour to each other." Obviously, there'd been more bickering. Life in the village continued pretty much as usual in the 1930s. The WI Hall had been an essential and integral part of the village ever since it was built, because the village has long provided its own entertainment. In the late 1920s, Gladys Gale formed a group of friends into a concert party called the Chums, which included Cynthia Coombs, later Stevens, seen third from the right, and then later in life. The men all dressed in blue Pierrot costumes, and they went on in the 1930s to give variety concerts, first in the schoolroom with lighting from Bob Frost's car headlights, and then in the WI Hall. The hall was built with a stage because of the tradition in the village of providing its own entertainment. This was in the form of reviews and concerts. All the women joined the WI, many joining as soon as they turned 16, under pressure from Mrs. Wratislaw at the White House. Static tableaus were very popular in the 1920s and 30s, and this photo shows members of the WI in the early 1930s putting on an entertainment in the hall, with Miss Codrington as Boadicea. Mrs. Gale put on several wartime shows before the soldiers took out the stage and used it as firewood. In 1939, the minutes record, "The coming years may be worse, but let us all do our share towards keeping the flag flying in our homes, village and country." We now see a change in activities to wartime cooking, making slippers from felt hats, cooperative fruit preservation, and a whisk drive for comforts for the troops. In 1939, the WI had 350,000 members nationally, and it was seen as a sanctuary for women. As you can see, women were still patronised, even in the adverts in the WI's own home and country. But the government recognised that the WI was a force that could be used in the case of a Second World War, as it had been in the First. War began on the 3rd of September 1939, and on the 6th of September, the WI began their jam drive. There was a glut of fruit, and Lord Woolton, at the Ministry of Food, gave the WI extra sugar for making jam, and this became the government's fruit preservation scheme. Home canning machines were sent from America. And the women of the WI were taught to use them. By 1945, there were 5,000 jam preserving centres supplying half the country's jam. Burton Bradstock WI was ready if war came, and some of the members in the 1930s are seen here with their children. In the spring of 1939, a note was sent from the WI to the parish council, offering the hall as a dressing station in case of injury by air raids. But this was superseded in the autumn of 1939, when the hall was used as a temporary school for children evacuated from London to Burton Bradstock. The trains usually came into Maiden Newton, and the Reverend and Mrs. Dittmer, a leading light in the village WI, met most trains and brought evacuees to the village. Mrs. Howarth, seen here, helped to rehome them. These were children like John Riggs and the girl we know as Liz Mackay, seen here with pigtails. The WI continued to use the hall for its meetings until the 26th of June 1940, when it was requisitioned by the Army at £60 a year. The hall had to be cleared by that night, the piano was removed to the church, and the caretaker was suspended. When the hall was not used as a billet, it could be used for dances, as a canteen, and for social occasions. So the WI went back to using the White House and gauges for committee meetings and the rookery for the main WI meetings. However, numbers dropped alarmingly because meetings were held at 2:30 p.m. because of the blackout, and many members were engaged in war work with long hours, home ties, and no help, so it was impossible to attend. There was some concern expressed about the soldiers' use of chairs. It was decided to remove them before the next regiment arrived, but Major Barrett requested the use of the chairs for entertainment, and he also wanted the loft cleared. So it wasn't until the end of 1942 that this was done, by which time 2 benches and 12 chairs had gone missing. It was said that soldiers had burned them in the stove for heating. In the war, meetings generally were about make, do and mend, with talks on making something out of nothing. Demonstrations on bottling and preserving were common. Burton had its own Home Guard and Red Cross auxiliary nurses. But most well known is that by 1944, the village was full of American as well as British soldiers, all preparing for D-Day. All the village women of all classes now helped to cater for the weekly dances in the hall. Village women began to mix better, and this was helped by the GIs, as they had no sense of class. They brought candy, nylons, and good humour to the village, joining in activities at the hall at the weekend when they could. Liz tells me that quite a few photographs were used for propaganda purposes to send back to America, showing the GIs happy and joining in village life in the UK. Look at the hall. It's decorated for Christmas in this photo, but perhaps not so lavishly as now. And is the little girl in the front dancing or trying to hold her knickers up? The WI, with its work on the home front, again gave purpose, focus, and friendship to rural women left at home. In Burton Bradstock, as elsewhere, members collected rose hips for servicemen and herbs for the pharmaceutical industry. In 1945, our WI raised the sum of £8, 17 shillings and sixpence for cigarettes for the Dorset Regiment, still serving in the Far East. In August 1945, the hall was decommissioned by the Southern Command, but it was in no fit state to be used. Repairs were begun when the War Department agreed damages and issued a licence. It was not until April 1946 that the WI Hall was again in use. Almost immediately, the organiser for school canteens requested use of the WI Hall kitchen for the preparation of dinners for the Bride Valley schools. All equipment necessary would be provided by the authorities, and the hall would be used from 9 a.m. to 2 p.m. And this was agreed. Another quite different request had come in May 1945, before the hall was decommissioned, from the Royal British Legion and its chairman, Mr. Howarth. They wanted to buy the hall to create a centre for the social and community life of the village. There were post-war grants available, but the WI could not, by the original covenant, sell to another organisation, but only to a properly constituted village community council. The late 1940s and 50s were the heyday of the hall, and these are WI members about 1950. There were dances almost every week, with whist drives, bingo, social events, concerts and meetings, making the hall the focus of most social occasions in the village. Even the food office used the hall for the distribution of ration books. By 1953, all loans were paid off, and in 1957, the hall was connected to the main sewerage system. One woman who never joined the WI was Mrs. Cheney at the Red House. She ran dances and whist drives in the hall for the Red Cross. One reason she gave for not joining was that Miss Codrington had insisted on a covenant linking her money guarantee to a stipulation that no drink should be allowed in the hall. There was a dance most Saturdays. The Three Shoes shut at 10:30 p.m, and the young men then went up to the hall dances, which ended at 11:45 p.m. Before going in, they buried bottles of beer in what is now Hilary Molesley's orchard. The first post-war show in the hall was Babes in the Wood in 1945, written by Gladys Gale and her sister Joan Wood, Janet Guppy's mother. Joan as principal boys on the left in breeches made out of blackout material, and Janet on the right was principal girl. Productions continued until the early 1950s and then stopped. In 1962, the WI decided to revive the productions and formed a WI drama group, with full-length pantos becoming an annual draw from 1966 with The Queen of Hearts. In 1969, Mary Bailey made her debut in The Pied Piper. There was a panto each year until 1980, with WI women playing all the parts, aided by village children. The men were only allowed to help backstage. However, the post-war years were not without problems for the WI in the village. The caretaker had to be paid more, and the drains were constantly blocked by grease from the school meals. The teenagers of the village joined the youth club in the hall and went to the village hop in the hall on a Saturday. There was trouble after some of the weekend dances, particularly from motorbike noise, and the police were asked to patrol outside. The hall was damaged by the youth club, in particular the walls and windows, and they were suspended for a year. Towards the end of the 1950s, the hall was showing signs of wear and tear on account of the increased usage. The hall floor was damaged beyond repair, and a new one was needed, which had to be wooden, as it was a dance floor. The hall also needed redecoration inside. In the early 60s, after floods, the stove was beyond repair, and you will notice Greenwich Cottage, Noreen's house, was flooded then too. Just when more money was needed, the Education Department terminated its lease with a loss of £80 a year, and the hall lets began to disappear, possibly due to more people in the village having TV and cars. If the 1940s and 50s were the heyday of the hall, the 1960s proved to be the nadir. Money was tight. Mrs. Wratislaw, a very active member of the WI committee who ran the youth club, loaned £300 interest-free for essential repairs. Sales of all sorts were held, and some ingenious money-making schemes were thought out. The most outstanding money spinner was bingo, this in spite of the fact that some members didn't approve and tried unsuccessfully to introduce Scrabble instead. A remorseless round of hall repairs and refurbishment began, with fundraising to pay for them. What was happening in the village was reflected nationally. The 60s saw a decline in membership as more women went out to work. Also, the 60s were swinging, and the WI wasn't. At this time in the 1960s, Miss Bickford was very active in the village. She was deputy head at Colfox School, and on a girl's 16th birthday, Miss Bickford would turn up at their door and insist that they join the WI, following time-honoured practice. Barbara Percy, who worked with Miss Bickford, can tell you how persuasive she could be. She retired to what is now Jill Redford's house and was president of the WI from 1967 to 1972. In 1967, the WI's 50th birthday, the minutes stated that we raise about £200 a year for maintaining the hall as a community centre for the village. In December 1970, the President, Miss Bickford, drew attention to the amount of effort and cost entailed in the maintenance of the hall and the increasingly heavy burden on the WI. Appeals to village organisations brought very little in the way of financial help. On the 12th of November 1973, the WI wrote asking the parish council to assist them by means of a substantial contribution from the rates to maintain the hall. The WI was by now a registered charity, and the WI committee stressed that it was, quote, a village amenity used by the Village Society, the British Legion, the Senior Citizens Club, and for lectures. The letter went on to state the following. A financial subcommittee was to be formed to include a parish council member if they would agree a grant. Certainly, an ongoing grant was never given. A grant came from the Rural Development Fund to cover 25% of costs, and the parish council gave £450, but only in 1994, towards the cost of kitchen renovations. However, this grant brought severe censure from the West Dorset District Council auditor because local council funds at that time were not to be given to a private or charitable organisation. The WI, however, were successful in getting £5,000 from the lottery to replace the central heating system. The WI joined in the village and Bridport carnivals, often led by Mary Bailey, who enjoyed fancy dress parades and encouraged the children to dress up too. Mary is seen here in the bathing costume in 1974. This tradition continued through the 80s and 90s, and to complete the story of the players, the big change came in 1981 when the WI finally allowed men to join the cast of Mother Goose. Mike Reed broke what the Bridport News said was probably the last female bastion of Burton Bradstock, the WI pantomime. Other men joined what was still advertised as the Burton Bradstock WI pantomime until 1986, when the drama group began to use the name Burton Bradstock Players. In addition, the WI ran an annual fair in the street outside the village hall. The last one was in May 2004 in pouring rain, and they kindly donated the takings to the new Village Hall Trust. The 90s saw declining membership nationally. It was the Calendar Girls in 2000 that gave the WI the boost they needed. It raised the WI profile so it could be seen as a fun organisation. The year 2000 saw another event that transformed the image of the WI when they slow-clapped Tony Blair because he was using his address to the AGM as a political platform, and it got massive coverage in the media.
The first sign that this master of the political stage might be losing his charismatic hold on the nation came in June 2000 at the annual conference of the Women's Institute.
I think he'd made a mistake imagining that these were a bunch of jam makers and flower arrangers.
Anyway, I'm delighted to be here. I'd like to start by congratulating you for the work that you do.
I've spent a long time trying to work very hard on the National Health Service. Thank you very much.
The political speech he attempted to deliver was a complete misjudgment of his audience.
To try and make sure.
The 90s was an interesting decade for Burton Bradstock WI. The 80th anniversary of the Village WI was in 1997, when Barbara Percy was president, here with the cake she made in June. The records show that it was a very successful year. The branch had 92 members, and the 1997 WI Spring Fair raised a record £2,107. In the summer, a tea party was held to celebrate the anniversary with an exhibition of photos called Days Gone By and a pantomime by members with a brief resume of the life of the WI since 1917. A promotion afternoon was held using Carol's photos to show what fun being a member could be. Cream Teas continued to raise funds and paid for a new sound system. And new name badges were made and worn, giving the members' name, interests, and original hometown. On Thursday, the 27th of November 1997 itself, a fashion show was held in the hall with Terry Weller bringing costumes dating from 1917 onwards. Refreshments were served, Lions Corner House style, with some members dressed as nippies. There was a special second cake cut by the retiring President Barbara and the new President, Wendy Green. To celebrate the new millennium, the WI was instrumental in organising and embroidering the Millennium Tapestry now in the library. However, in 2004, the WI decided it could no longer manage and maintain the hall on its own. And in January 2005, the management of the WI Hall was given to the Burton Bradstock Village Hall Trust on a long lease of 40 years at a peppercorn rent of £5 a year. The WI, as a national organisation, has made history, and the WI in the village has greatly contributed to the shape of the history of Burton Bradstock in the 20th century. The presidents since 1967 are listed on the board to my right, and the plaque at the back commemorates two formidable village WI ladies who in the 1930s got this hall built and around which much of the village's history has evolved. Home and Country was replaced in 2006 with WI Life, which tells of more and more evening branches opening, with young working women wanting to be part of an organisation which relentlessly pursues female and family issues. Groups with names like the Deptford Wives and the Shoreditch Sisters. Maybe we should consider the Burton Biddies, or better, the Burton Babes. Just a thought. And their leader. The WI is a remarkable organisation, and in my view, any organisation which can get its members to knit spoons to dip in porcelain must be a force to be reckoned with.